Idi Amin ruled Uganda with the swagger of a liberator, but behind palace doors, his regime became known for something far darker. A system of brutal terror so horrifying that even his wives lived in fear of being the next to disappear. In just one night, his second wife, Kay Adroa, went from educated bride to dismembered warning, her murder concealed behind the state's myth of order. This is not the story of a dictator's private vices. It's the beginning of a national nightmare, where Amin's bedroom became the first of many hunting grounds. How did a celebrated revolutionary turn his country into a living hell no one dared name? The truth is harder to stomach than anyone imagines. Idi Amin seized power in January 1971, marching his troops into Kampala under the cover of darkness. Crowds cheered as tanks rolled past, but the man at the center of it all had already learned to hide violence behind a smile. Raised in the remote northwest, among the Kakwa people, Amin grew up hearing stories of warriors who proved themselves through blood and ritual. As a young man, he joined the King's African Rifles, the colonial regiment that trained Ugandan recruits to enforce British rule. In the barracks, Amin's reputation spread quickly. He was strong, fearless, and quick to use force. Fellow soldiers whispered about his appetite for pain, both on and off the battlefield. By the late 1960s, Amin had become the most feared officer in Uganda. He spoke little about his private life, but those close to him saw the signs. Women described sudden mood swings, charm one moment, fists the next. He boasted about his conquests, treating lovers and wives as trophies to be collected and discarded. According to Henry Kayemba, a former minister, Amin spoke openly about violence as proof of manhood, once declaring that women were spoils of war. In the officers' mess, he laughed about beatings, and his subordinates learned to stay silent. The coup that put Amin in command was swift, but his methods were anything but subtle. Political rivals vanished overnight, their families warned never to ask questions. Amin's first wife, Sarah Mutesi Kibedi, later recalled being beaten while pregnant for questioning his affairs. Hospitals patched her up in secret, fearing what might happen if word spread. As Amin consolidated power, he surrounded himself with loyalists from his home region, men who shared his distrust of outsiders and his taste for intimidation. Publicly, Amin promised unity and prosperity. Privately, he began to turn the presidential palaces into places of fear. Orders were barked in the middle of the night. Staff learned to tiptoe past locked doors. The boundaries between military discipline and personal cruelty faded, setting the stage for a regime where no one, wife, rival, or servant, was ever truly safe. March 1974. Kay Adroa, Amin's second wife, was 8 months pregnant when she vanished from their home. She was university educated, admired for her intelligence, and her family had tried to shield her from Amin's violent world. But no one refused him. In the days before her disappearance, palace staff noticed Kay's name missing from the bedroom rotation list. Rumors spread among the wives. Some whispered that Kay had confronted Amin about his affairs. Others said she was planning to leave, or had simply become inconvenient. Her body was found in the trunk of a government car, left outside Kampala Hospital. Medical examiners who opened the trunk recoiled at the sight. The autopsy, later cited in international case files, confirmed that her heart was still beating when the mutilation began. Hospital staff, forced at gunpoint, stitched her remains back together for identification. Amin insisted her children view the body, declaring, "This is what happens to women who betray." He ordered a public statement. Kay had died from complications of pregnancy, but the truth spread quickly in palace corridors and among government officials. The message was clear. no wife, no matter her education or status, could question Amin and survive. The murder sent shockwaves through Kampala's elite. Women who had once dared to speak out now moved in silence. Family members of other wives fled the country or went into hiding, terrified that a single word could bring the same fate. Kay's death closed the door on any illusion of safety inside Amin's household. The violence that began with private beatings had crossed a line. Now, even the most intimate relationships were governed by terror and spectacle. The palaces were no longer homes. They were crime scenes, ruled by a man who used murder as both punishment and warning. August 1974. Kampala buzzed with foreign delegations as Uganda hosted the Organization of African Unity Conference. Heads of state, diplomats, and press crowded the capital. In the middle of the summit, Idi Amin staged a wedding. The bride, Sarah Kioloba, was just 19. Days earlier, she had been engaged to a young man named Charles, a medical student. She was already pregnant with his child. Amin's security forces tracked Charles down and executed him. The order came from the president himself. Sarah was told her fiancé had died in a car accident, but palace insiders later revealed the truth. That same afternoon, she was taken from her home and brought to the presidential residence. There was no time to grieve. The wedding was announced as a national celebration. Dignitaries filled the hall, their invitations marked with the OAU's official seal. Uniformed guards lined the aisles. Sarah wore a white dress, her face blank. Amin appeared in full military regalia, smiling for the cameras. Foreign journalists described the event as surreal, a forced ceremony staged for the world. In the crowd, some whispered about the missing fiancé. Others watched in silence, afraid to meet Amin's gaze. After the vows, a state banquet followed. Guests toasted the couple, but Sarah did not eat. That night, she was escorted to the main bedroom. Staff later recalled hearing her sobbing behind closed doors. There was no escape. The next morning, Amin paraded his new wife before the press, boasting of his power and virility. He called her the most beautiful woman in Uganda, but palace staff knew what had happened. Diplomatic cables from British and French embassies described the wedding as an act of terror disguised as pageantry. The message was clear. No one, not even a pregnant teenager, could refuse Amin. International observers left Kampala unsettled. For Sarah, the ceremony was both wedding and funeral. She had entered the palace as a fiancée and left as property. The world had witnessed her abduction, and no one intervened. By 1975, the State Research Bureau had become the regime's most feared machine. With over 3,000 agents spread across Uganda, the SRB operated above the law, answering only to Amin himself. Their orders were clear: find, abduct, and deliver women for the president's pleasure and the terror of his enemies. The process was clinical. Agents arrived at schools, universities, and villages with lists in hand, selecting girls and young women deemed suitable. Sometimes it was the daughters of politicians. Other times it was students from Makerere or nurses from city clinics. At night, SRB vehicles moved through neighborhoods, headlights off, engines barely idling. Witnesses described the knock at the door, the demand for a name, the screams that followed. Parents who protested were threatened with disappearance or death. Inside SRB headquarters, personnel files tracked every abduction. Names, ages, ethnic backgrounds, and even physical descriptions were logged by clerks. One former agent, interviewed years later, recalled, "Every morning our lists arrived. Who was to be delivered to the president? Who to the generals? There were no refusals, only consequences." The operation ran with military efficiency. Survivors from Makerere University described how agents entered dormitories, shining flashlights into faces, pulling the chosen from their beds. A teacher later testified, "They came to the dormitories at night, selecting the prettiest girls. Most never returned. Those who did were broken, physically and mentally." The 1972 expulsion of Uganda's Asian community brought another wave of violence. While most families fled, some women were seized at checkpoints or in the chaos of departure. Reports of abductions circulated among refugee networks, but no full accounting was ever made. The SRB's appetite for new victims knew no boundaries of ethnicity or status. At its peak, the network processed hundreds of captives each week, shuttling them through a system designed for secrecy and speed. The agents themselves became ghosts, moving between palaces, safe houses, and torture centers. No one intervened. No one was safe. The machinery of abduction fed directly into the next stage, chambers where pain replaced hope and survival depended on silence. Inside the State Research Bureau's chambers, cruelty became a daily routine. The rooms were soundproofed, stripped of comfort, and fitted with restraints bolted to the floor. SRB agents brought in women at all hours, their names logged in files marked for special attention. Many arrived still in school uniforms or hospital scrubs, used with methodical precision. Multiple agents would take turns, sometimes in front of each other, sometimes while the victim's screams echoed down tiled corridors. Torture followed a practiced sequence. Heated metal rods, pliers, and crude surgical tools were laid out on tables, never enough to kill. Amnesty International later described survivors with permanent burns and scarring. Some women were forced to watch as others were mutilated, a warning to stay silent. Medical staff, forced to treat the aftermath, documented wounds that could only have come from deliberate sadistic acts. For some, the torture ended with a bullet. For others, it was months before release, broken in body and mind. Every detail was recorded in SRB manuals, turning sexual violence into official policy. The machinery of pain kept running, always searching for new ways to destroy. In the depths of Mengo Palace, the most feared punishment waited in silence. Prisoners called it the Electric River. The design was simple, a shallow trench filled with water, live wires threaded just below the surface. SRB guards forced men and women to wade in, ankles and calves submerged. A Tanzanian engineer, part of the team that stormed the palace in 1979, later described the control panel, voltage dials, warning lights, switches labeled in Russian. The current could be adjusted. Too high, and the victim died instantly. Too low, and the pain would stretch for hours. Survivors remember the sound first, a low hum, growing sharper as the current increased. Some were left standing for entire afternoons, skin blistering, muscles convulsing, urine and blood mixing in the water. One escaped captive recalled, "They made us watch. If you fell, they shocked you again. If you screamed, they laughed." Guards sometimes bet on who would collapse first. No one left the room unscarred. When the SRB wanted to send a message, they brought in groups, forcing prisoners to witness the agony of others. Some jumped into the water by choice, desperate for an end. The Electric River became a symbol of Amin's rule. Suffering engineered, pain measured out by the hour, and death delivered at the turn of a dial. Inside the presidential palaces, horror took on new forms. Moses Mukasa, a palace servant, remembered being ordered to clean them. Amin called these remains his trophies, souvenirs from enemies he claimed to have outsmarted or silenced. He would open a refrigerator door, point to a severed head, and tell visitors, "This one talked too much." At state dinners, the atmosphere was lavish but tense. British operative Robert Astles described banquets where Amin served what he called special meat. Guests praised the flavor, unaware of what they were eating. Only after the plates were cleared would Amin reveal the truth. Others stared in shock, too frightened to react. Refusal to eat was not an option. Before military campaigns, Amin staged rituals that blurred the line between power and madness. He would gather his inner circle, order the heart or liver of a murdered rival brought to him, in front of witnesses. State functionaries chanted in local dialects. Human bones were burned as incense. Amin believed these acts transferred the strength and knowledge of his victims. Educated opponents especially were targeted for these ceremonies. The message was unmistakable. Resistance would lead to annihilation, not just of the body, but of the soul. Every ritual, every feast, was a demonstration of absolute control. In Amin's Uganda, terror was not hidden. It was displayed, consumed, and passed around the dinner table. By 1979, the numbers told a story that words could barely contain. Amnesty International compiled reports of more than 200,000 Ugandans murdered or disappeared under Amin's rule. The State Research Bureau's own files, recovered in the aftermath, listed thousands of names, each a life ended or broken by torture, rape, or execution. At least 50,000 women and girls were tortured, according to survivor testimonies and university research. Forced marriages, mass abductions, and sexual slavery became routine, not rumor. For every individual named in the files, dozens more remained uncounted, lost to unmarked graves, the Nile, or the silence imposed by fear. International agencies watched from a distance. British Foreign Office cables, declassified decades later, described a climate of terror and detailed reports of sexual violence and mass killings. CIA briefings acknowledged the scale of the atrocities but weighed intervention against Cold War alliances. Stability was valued over justice. No rescue came. The United Nations debated resolutions as bodies floated down the Nile, and diplomats filed their reports, knowing the truth but refusing to act. Uganda's agony became a matter of paperwork, typed memos, redacted names, and closed-door meetings in London, Washington, and New York. While the world calculated risks, Amin's regime kept counting victims. The true toll will never be known. Records were destroyed, witnesses silenced, and mass graves swallowed the evidence. What remains are estimates: 200,000 dead, 50,000 traumatized. The numbers are staggering, but the stories behind them are even harder to bear. By 1979, over 3,000 State Research Bureau agents enforced Idi Amin's rule, conducting systematic abductions, torture, and sexual violence, as confirmed by declassified intelligence files and survivor testimonies. Evidence from palace servants, autopsy reports, and international observers proves that Amin's regime mutilation and ritual cannibalism, crimes that left at least 200,000 dead and tens of thousands more scarred. Yet, the full number of victims remains unknown, with many files still classified and countless stories never recorded. Historians agree that Amin's use of state power for personal predation set a new standard for brutality in post-colonial Africa. Today, Uganda continues to confront this legacy, as the documentation of these crimes is used to educate new generations and support survivor recognition. The facts leave no doubt. Idi Amin's reign was a uniquely horrifying chapter in history, and only by facing its documented reality can future atrocities be prevented.